With the glory days of stop motion behind us by the early 80s for the most part, and computer-generated effects still ways ahead, the glorious suitmation mastered by Japanese filmmakers was still the best bet for giant monster movies. And in a classic East meets West fashion, the two giant monsters of cinema eventually duked it out. But it took another 14 years for King Kong to return to the big screen, and in that 14 years we got plenty of Godzilla, and it was awesome. So what do you do with the big fella after all that time? You just sort of take the same story and modernize it for the 1970s audiences. And who better to helm such an epic undertaking than prolific and legendary producer Dino De Laurentiis and directed by journeyman director John Guillermin. John Guillermin was a pretty accomplished director, especially in action and adventure films, having directed a few Tarzans and the classic 70s disaster epic The Towering Inferno. So making his first big screen appearance since 1962, we were given the 1976 King Kong. The plot structure of this film is pretty similar to the 1933 King Kong, except now it's the 70s and instead of ambitious filmmakers propelling the story forward, it's a greedy big-time oil executive played by the great Charles Grodin.
I love my nephew!
What's his name?
I want to say Mason.
And he believes that there's an island hidden by a fog bank that will be ripe with oil for the taking. And sneaking on board, our protagonist is prime 70s hunky Jeff Bridges. And he plays a primate paleontologist that thinks there may be something other than oil that will be found on this island. And while out on their voyage, they rescue Jessica Lange's character, an aspiring actress and sole survivor of a yacht explosion. From the get-go, you can tell that her character and Jeff Bridges' character are going to be romantically involved. But our boy Kong might have something to say about that. They eventually reach the island only to discover that it is not uninhabited and the supposed oil is basically no good for 10,000 years. So what's the next best thing when you can't rake in the big oil dollars? It's capturing a mythically large ape worshipped by natives. And if Charles Grodin can capture Cujo and tame him into the family-loving dog Beethoven, I'm sure he can handle a big ape. Right? I think that's the plot of that movie.
You know, this is ridiculous. It's a dog. He doesn't have preferences. You could call him Ding Dong.
So how does a 1970s King Kong film fare against its predecessors? Well, I'd say it's okay. Besides catching glimpses of this King Kong on cable channels when I was younger, I barely knew this one even existed. So I was kind of skeptical on what the enjoyment factor would be. I was disappointed that despite having three pretty great actors in the lead roles, how dull the characters were for the most part. Jessica Lange's character seems like she's in a different movie, to the point where I couldn't tell if she was terrible or possibly the greatest ever.
I'm a Libra. What sign are you? Don't tell me.
It's a weird, kind of campy-esque ditzy blonde performance, but it's really kind of fun to witness. And there's an odd sexual chemistry between her and Kong. I'm not sure how intentional any of that is, but it's the most interesting part of this movie. Then there's Charles Grodin, who starred in one of the great comedies of the 90s.
Oh, honey, be careful while you eat your cereal. Use a napkin. This boy and his cereal.
He really isn't given too much to work with and feels kind of generic and kind of lacks the impact of his 1933 King Kong counterpart. The dude himself, Jeff Bridges, worked the most for me, especially as the moral center of the very unethical exploitation of Kong. He's the only character that really conveys very well the moral dilemma of all the Kong shenanigans. And can you really go wrong with 70s scruffy looking hippie Jeff Bridges? And then there's the last really notable character, the wide-eyed, sex-crazed big guy Kong. Now I've got to say, when it comes to practical effects like stop motion, puppets, rubber suits, or gorilla suits, I'm pretty easy to please. It's definitely an improvement over the King Kong vs. Godzilla suit, although I am more likely to rewatch that before I go back to this one anytime soon. It's pretty apparent that this King Kong is more serious and isn't really trying to go for the big fun sense of adventure, especially the Skull Island parts. I mean, Skull Island feels like it was barely explored. In this version, the only cool Skull Island monster fight we get is against a giant snake, and while that was pretty fun, that was about all you get. I can appreciate that this is a more mature Kong film and is trying to be more socially conscious of the colonialism and environmental issues. There just isn't much in this film to keep you that engaged, and there's not really any Kong rampaging destruction in the city. I mean, these are supposed to be special effect driven types of movies, and it certainly lacks there. Of all the Kong movies I've covered so far, this is probably my least favorite, but I don't think I would ever tell anyone to completely skip this one. I'd almost recommend it solely on the weird energy between Kong and Jessica Lange's character. So stay tuned for the sequel, King Kong Lives, at some point soonish.